My name is Lilo Armandi, and my ego is a liar. And guess what? Yours is too. I'm a combat veteran, mother, and recovering high performer. This is a show about the lies we tell ourselves, how they shape us, how they break us, and what it takes to finally let them go. Let's uncover our lies to seek the truths underneath. Because before there's clarity, there's chaos. Let's navigate it together. So don your oxygen mask and take a deep breath. Welcome to Lies My Ego Told Me. Welcome back, liars and truth seekers, to the season finale of Lies My Ego Told Me, which I'm very proud to say is now an award-winning podcast. We opened the season with a trailblazing veteran, and I'm honored to be able to do the same as we close out what I hope is the first of many seasons to come. I'm Lilo, and today's guest is someone I've personally admired for almost 2 decades. Someone whose circles overlapped mine so closely, but it wasn't until preparing for this episode that we were finally able to meet. They say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but let me tell you, she did not disappoint. Nicole FiFi Malachowski was a fighter pilot and the first woman to fly on the Air Force Thunderbirds demo team. She commanded a fighter squadron, earned multiple degrees, and served in the White House not once, not twice, but 3 times. Unsurprisingly, she was the poster child for the Air Force for nearly a decade. But then she was abandoned, completely cast aside. What she never expected to become was the face of a life-threatening illness that doctors repeatedly dismissed and became the voice for millions of other patients who were told their suffering wasn't real. What makes her story so powerful isn't what she achieved. It's what she fought for and what she fought through. And when the medical system and the institution she loved left her behind, she turned that betrayal into a mission. FiFi, thank you for being here. I'm so looking forward to this conversation that I know is going to be both enlightening and moving.
Well, thanks for having me, sister. And it is nice to finally meet you. I feel like since we overlap so much that I already know you, but it's always a joy to join another Strike Eagle sister.
So as you said, you and I flew the same aircraft, the F-15E Strike Eagle, which arguably is the greatest aircraft ever made. And I cannot wait for the trolls to come for us on that one. But going back to the very beginning with the very basic tenets of military aviation, we are taught to always stay in formation. We fly together and we are tethered to our wingman. So what was it that you believed, the principle that you lived by that ultimately turned its back on you?
Never leave your wingman.
It's not just rhetoric, it's day one indoctrination. As a young wingman, as a flight lead, as the Thunderbird number 3, flying inches away from another aircraft at 400 miles per hour, that trust is everything. What does it mean to be a wingman? And what are those sacred tenets of formation flying?
Yeah, I think about it in 2 different ways, right? The combat flying I did in the F-15E Strike Eagle, and then, of course, that close formation flying on the Thunderbirds. When we think back to combat, it's all about this idea that we are going to go in together in a high-risk, dangerous situation, right? We're going to put our lives on the line, and I will make sure that I do everything in my power to bring everybody in my formation home, right? There is no higher honor than to fly into combat on somebody's wing. That's their way of saying, I trust you to go into this high risk area. I trust you literally with my life. It is that deep and it's that important. I think talk about F-16s and flying, close formation on the Thunderbirds. It's all about that trust. We're making thousands of micro decisions during an air show, thousands of micro movements. We're not just talking about being accurate within feet. We're talking about being accurate within inches. And it's this idea that if I don't fulfill my role, if I am not accountable and responsible to my specific role in the formation, how that can have catastrophic consequences and how we have to trust each other to be the best at our individual roles so that that formation can come together in alignment as the giant, beautiful Delta formation that you see at the end.
And what did wearing the uniform, not just the Air Force uniform, but then representing the Air Force in, that very iconic Thunderbird blue uniform, what did that represent to you about belonging to something bigger?
I think it meant being a part of this thread of Air Force Blue, right? The history that happened when the Army Air Corps became the United States Air Force and joining this, what we often call the long blue line, making my contribution, our team's contribution at that time to eventually pass the torch to the next generation. I always loved as a young kid watching like the Veterans Day parades or whatever, and because I loved watching people march in uniform, right? From far away, everyone's wearing the same color. You don't necessarily notice gender. You don't care about rank. You don't see their name tag. You don't see their ribbons. You just see that Air Force blue. And I wanted to be part of that. And, whether I was doing that as a Thunderbird or just as a fighter pilot, it meant something to be part of something bigger than myself.
I think sometimes it's challenging to understand that immediate bond, that willingness to put our lives on the line for one another. It just comes easily to us. And it's because trust and loyalty and commitment to each other are just so deeply embedded in military culture. For me, it was almost a comfort the first time I went into combat. The fact that we have an entire organization that is dedicated to that promise. So in the US, we have the POW MIA agency, and they're charged with the recovery and accountability of every single service member. And it goes back as far as World War II. And so decades after war's end, we're still searching for the missing because we don't leave anybody behind. Did you believe that if you ever needed it, if you ever went down, if something catastrophic were to happen, that you would not be left behind and the same thing would apply to you?
I felt 100% confident that if something catastrophic happened in combat, that I would not be left behind. I felt 100% confident that that wingman contract, would be enforced.
And yet there's people who served, right? People who've proved themselves, people who gave their lives in support of the defense of our nation, who were easily forgotten. So as exciting as the first half of your career was, I want to jump ahead to when you were a major and you served as a White House fellow, and this was your first time serving in the White House. You were instrumental in drafting legislation to ensure that the women's Air Force service pilots of World War II received the Congressional Gold Medal they'd been denied for 65 years. So tell me about the WASPs and why their story mattered to you.
Well, from a personal level, the WASP are absolutely my heroes. And I think that you would agree with me. If not for the efforts of the WASP back in World War II, neither you nor I would have had the opportunity to fly fighter aircraft and to serve our country in that capacity. So for your listeners, the women Air Force service pilots of World War II were indeed America's first women military aviators. They flew every kind of aircraft, doing every kind of mission stateside. So they were responsible for being test pilots. And so they were a part of saving the entire free world. And it sounds really dramatic, right? But if not for the WASP, teaching these men how to fly and training them to go overseas in combat, there's absolutely no way that we would have had the success, I think, that we ultimately had in World War II. And so they were protectorates, if you will, of the entire free world. And a lot of people in our country don't know about them, right? Because when they served, there were actually 1,102 women who were WASP, and 38 of them actually died in service to our country. They were very unceremoniously disbanded at the end of the war. They were forced to pay their own flight home. The women that actually passed away in service in accidents, their fellow classmates had to kind of pool their own money together to actually ship the bodies back home. All of this to say that they were completely ignored. And when they were disbanded, their actual records and archive of records of their service, if you will, were actually closed, classified secret, and put into the archives. And so that's why the WASP history, isn't part of, if you will, the knowledge. And so I found myself as a White House fellow in a location and in a job where I had access to maybe rooms and opportunities that I probably had no business, if you will, as a young major, having access to. And I thought to myself, what's something that we can do in this 1 year as a White House fellow? And it occurred to me, as I got to know WASP over the years and listen to their stories and be inspired by them, they really could care less about recognition. They could care less about awards or medals. What they wanted was to correct the record, right? What we wanted was to have the facts-based history of their contributions to saving the entire free world to be available, to be known, to be broken free of the shadows of the archives. And that was really the purpose of the Congressional Gold Medal, to correct the record.
Right. Because it wasn't, like you said, about the accolades. It's about speaking the truth. Like, for their service to have been denied is a black mark on our history.
Absolutely. And remember, after they were disbanded, I think it took something like 33 years for them to even get veterans benefits. They didn't earn the Congressional Gold Medal until 2010. And it was still several years after that before they were allowed to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery. We had to right a wrong. And that's really what the Congressional Gold Medal was about.
Absolutely. And you had the distinct honor of being able to attend the ceremony at the Capitol. What did that moment mean to you, being able to represent not only the Air Force, but pioneering women everywhere?
I think it was absolutely an extraordinary day. It was a day of excitement. I think it was a day of deep emotion. And I think it was a day of pride. Pride in these women and their contribution, to see the joy on their faces, to see them finally being treated with the respect and the dignity and like the heroes that they truly were. I have a hard time actually, Lilo, describing it in words. All I know is like my heart was swelling with pride and excitement and joy for them. And I think also the other thing was not just the smiles on their faces and this recognition that they had to wait a lifetime for, but the pride in their family and friends that joined them. A lot of family and friends didn't even really, I think, fully understand or appreciate what the WASP had done until they heard about it at this ceremony. And so to see those kind of bonds of family and friends deepen was also pretty impactful.
Amazing. And did you see yourself in their story? The people who serve, people who prove themselves, but were left behind?
Well, I think it's all part of this long blue line, right? I mean, I think the WASP story is going to be tethered to the story of the first women who went to pilot training, tethered to the story of, your and my hero, Jeannie Leavitt, who broke into fighter aircraft for all of us. And the hope is that this long blue line that started with the WASP, continues. And so without them, we wouldn't have these stories to tell today. We owe the WASP a lot.
Absolutely. And in 2012, you become a lieutenant colonel. You become a commander of a fighter squadron in North Carolina, which I think personally is kind of the peak in any military leader's career when you get to lead a unit at that level. And one day you get a tick bite and you end up with the classic bullseye rash. Tell me what happened when you went to the doctor.
It was the summer of 2012, and actually I had been feeling pretty sick for about 2 weeks. Flu-like symptoms, fever, malaise, a little bit of joint and muscle pain. And about 2 weeks into this, I presented with the bullseye rash. Now, at that time, I did not know I had been bitten by a tick, nor did I know what a bullseye rash was. And I remember going to the military flight surgeon that was assigned to our squadron, told him my symptoms, and I showed him my rash. And it was interesting enough to him that he went out of the room for a little bit and brought in, he was a young captain, he brought in a full bird colonel, a reservist who happened to be there that week for his reserve duty. And they both sat there and talked about me in front of me, right? And they both looked at that rash, and I will never forget the words, because this is the day that I became chronically ill forever. They looked at each other and said, "We do not have Lyme disease in North Carolina," end quote. And therefore, this must be a spider bite. So they gave me some topical steroidal cream, 5 days of an oral antibiotic, and sent me on my way. And that was the day that changed my life forever.
But within weeks, you have over 60 symptoms. At one point, which is terrifying, you said that you couldn't even find the radio switch in your aircraft, which is a plane that you had flown for 15 years. It almost becomes an extension of your own body, and you can't find the simplest of switches. What was that moment like for you?
It was absolutely terrifying. It was scary, and it was ultimately very confusing because, as you said, I'd been flying that aircraft for well over a decade. And I remember it was we were coming back from a training mission. So when this happened, it was just simple air traffic control just to navigate back to home base for a landing. It wasn't a complicated portion of the mission, but I was just noticing I was having cognitive problems, failure to organize, failure to make decisions, and then just really bad long and short-term memory problems. And air traffic control gave me a simple heading change, and I just froze. And then I realized, okay, these are the words I'm supposed to say. And that took me a good 5 seconds, right? Something that would have happened naturally took me like 5 cognitive seconds. And then I realized I had no idea how to activate the mic. The good news was I actually had an instructor pilot in the back seat because I was giving him a check ride for his backseat landings because we were a training squadron. And I basically gave him command of the jet. And when I landed, that's when I basically grounded myself. And it's hard to be a fighter squadron commander and not fly. And I get asked a lot, Lilo, like, Nicole, do you have any regrets? And they always think I'm going to say, no regrets. I do have one regret. Mm-hmm. My big regret is that I did not know my last flight in the F-15E was going to be my last flight.
Oh, wow.
I did not know my last flight as a pilot in command was going to be my last flight. And I look back on that and go, gosh, I wish I had known.
And was that the last flight that you're talking about?
That was it. summer of 2012. It's painful to think about.
I also respect the fact that you were able to recognize that you were not in a good situation and you weren't forcing yourself to push through, and you didn't have this, delusion of grandeur where I'm going to fight through this, that I need to stop. This is putting myself and somebody else in danger.
Well, that goes back to the whole premise we talked about earlier, right? Which is this idea of never leave your wingman behind. That's about safety. That's about saying, I will only be on your wing or lead you into combat if I'm 100%, confident in my skill sets and 100% ready to go. And I don't want to break that bond of trust.
Yeah. And I've heard of chick magnets before, but you, my friend, are a tick magnet, because what's incredible about your story is that after you finish command, which was incredibly successful, you get sent to Rhode Island to attend Naval War College. And it's at this duty station that you get bitten again by a tick. And you told me that this is the one that saved your life. What did you mean by that?
What I mean by that is on that first rash that we had in North Carolina, I never saw a tick and we didn't equate it to a tick bite. Hindsight being what it is, we know what it was. This second bite in Rhode Island, we actually saw the engorged tick on the back of my leg, and my husband actually removed it. And that allowed us to start thinking about tick bites, tick-borne illnesses, and the type of symptoms that can come from those infections.
Was that the first time you actually presumed that it would be a tick bite? Because before, did you just dismiss your previous one as a spider bite? You trusted your doctors?
100% trusted my doctors. Their lack of education and awareness, my lack of education and awareness, led us down really bad paths. They were thinking maybe I had multiple sclerosis. And then when I didn't meet those, they thought fibromyalgia. When I didn't meet those criteria, then they start throwing the gaslighting, right? Which becomes it's neuropsychiatric or psychosomatic. And so this second tick bite was nice because I had physical proof that there was a tick. And then I could get them, to start taking tick-borne illness more seriously.
And from that first bite over the next 4 years, you saw 24 plus doctors, and your health is just rapidly deteriorating. And at your worst, you can't walk, speak, eat on your own. At one point, you had symptoms that were similar to locked-in syndrome for almost 9 months. Your husband becomes your primary caregiver. Your kids are really young at this point, and you're missing these milestones. And where are you mentally at this point?
I mean, this is actually, the hardest thing I ever went through in my entire life. I was bedridden for the vast majority of 2016 and 2017, to your point. I was bedridden overnight. My husband became my caregiver. And our twins, who between the ages of 6 and 7, I was not allowed, I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't interact with them. I lost those 2 years of mothering them. So it's a deep, dark place because you realize everything that I have been since I was 17 years old, right? That's when I showed up at the Air Force Academy. I took my first oath to the Constitution. I put on that blue uniform. I anticipated staying in the Air Force for as long as I could. I would still love to be in the Air Force today as I'm talking to you. But the slow realization that everything, my whole life up to this point is going to change overnight was a hard pill to swallow.
And how did you go from being this high performer, this elite officer, the poster child of the Air Force, to bedridden and almost becoming a prisoner of your own body?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how it happened. You mentioned from that first bullseye rash to the time of my diagnosis was 1,525 days of doctor's appointments, suffering, a little bit of gaslighting thrown in, 24 plus doctors across 8 specialties. And I endured 3 misdiagnoses while I was in there. And this whole time, nobody's actively helping me. It was this realization that I have to advocate for myself, right? And between me and my husband, he's the greatest wingman I've ever had. We together discovered my diagnosis. We together did the research. We together went through my medical records and got to the bottom of this. And so it was sad and frustrating and scary, but I was also found myself extremely determined because I was going to die unless I figured this out.
You mentioned that you and your husband looked at the symptoms and really came up with the diagnosis. And you mentioned people saying it was like neuropsychiatric, for 2 people who are incredibly capable and 2 people who are incredibly credible, to be gaslit to that extent for that long period of time is really terrifying. Because what about the person that doesn't have the resources? What about the person that can't use their voice or has never been able to use their voice? I don't really have another way to describe it other than gaslighting. So tell me about the rest of the doctors. And when you're continuing to say, hey, like, this is not what you're diagnosing me as, what are they saying to you?
Well, the thing that I found interesting about the medical system is late stage tick-borne illness, which is what I had because I had Lyme disease plus 4 other tick-borne pathogens. That's ultimately what I'll be diagnosed with. But late stage tick-borne illness is a multisystemic disease and it impacts every system in the body. And our medical system likes to kind of divide you into specialties, right? So, the person who's a neurologist can't figure it out. So they're like, you don't fit a neurology diagnosis. So I'm going to send you to, gastroenterology, and gastroenterology kind of goes, so everyone's just pawning you off as a problem to somebody else. Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't, military medicine is really good at acute things, right? Yeah. You break your leg. I can help you. You have a bad run-in with an IED. I mean, look at how amazing military medicine has been as far as battlefield medicine and the advancements there. But you got something that's complex, chronic, and multisystemic. Whoo. We don't know what to do with that. And so there was nobody quarterbacking for me. And remember, this is now a brain infection. So my ability to think, to speak, to organize is being handed over to my poor husband, who's doing his best to think and speak and organize on my behalf. We were all we had. There was no support from the medical system. And I want to say not only military medicine, because at this point, they're also sending me to civilian specialists. And we saw the same problem, breaking people's bodies into individual systems, no overarching quarterback, and just denial. If I would bring in peer-reviewed literature that I printed, from the NIH or from the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic, can you please read this and let's talk about it? Nope. And I remember after my diagnosis, Lilo, and a couple years after retirement, I got to a place where, I was independent and thinking and walking and talking again. I reached out to all 24 plus of those doctors and I said, hey, here's what my diagnosis was. I would love to talk to you about it and why you should have connected my gastroenterology symptoms or my dermatology symptoms or my neurology symptoms, to Lyme and tick-borne illness. Would love to meet with you. Only one of those 24 plus doctors took me up on that. And it was the sleep doctor at Walter Reed, who was an 05 in the U.S. Navy. And he sat and he listened to me with caring and compassion and most importantly, curiosity.
Wow.
And I was able to teach one doctor, but the other 23, never heard from them. I called the military flight surgeon, right? The one that said, we don't have Lyme disease in North Carolina. This is now maybe 2 or 3 years after I was medically retired. And I told him, hey, here's what went on, dude. That was the day I became chronically ill. I need you to hear this story. And he actually laughed. He laughed. He goes, well, we did the best we could. Looks like you're doing pretty good today, FiFi. You're making a lot of money out there as a professional speaker. I see you all over social media. He didn't even hear. He didn't even want to listen or hear. And the sad part is he's now a doctor in the VA medical system.
Which is so crazy because do ticks not exist in North Carolina? They just know the border and they don't cross it.
Yeah, they need passports, right? State passports. Yeah.
And what was crazy about this story is that, when they couldn't diagnose you and when they were saying, it's all in your head, one doctor's solution for you was you should retire, which tell me about that.
I actually distinctly remember this day, and it's really good for him that I was sick and was struggling to speak. Because I have a feeling this little meeting was going to go a different way. So I had been sick at this point for 4 years. We still didn't have a diagnosis. I still, was not returned to flight duty, rightfully so. I'm struggling, to hold on to my career. And they send me to Walter Reed, to the rheumatology department, and there's a Navy 06. Now, at this point, I'm an Air Force 06, right? So this is Colonel to Navy Captain, right? Mm-hmm. He should know a little bit of that I've been in for over 20 years. So, I'm credible like he is. And with all the symptoms and things that I wanted to talk about, and I had my note and I was struggling to speak, he spent a grand total of, I remember, I actually timed this because I was so pissed at this point at the medical system. He spent 4 minutes and 27 seconds with me before he said, quote, You've been a high-performing woman in a male-dominated career field for a very long time. Maybe this is your body's way of saying it's time to retire, end quote. And I got up and walked out. Well, stumbled out.
Yeah.
I was about to be in a wheelchair. Within weeks of that, I was in a wheelchair. The irony, Lilo, right, is he's saying it's all in your head. And the irony is, indeed it was. It's called a brain infection. Thanks.
Right, exactly. But what's really extraordinary about this, and we touched on it just a little bit, is that during that 4-year period of fighting for your life, right, you are completing your time as a commander. You go to Naval War College, where you graduate not only with honors, but you graduate as the honor graduate. So the number one graduate in this very male dominated profession. And then you get selected to be an executive director of joining forces, which meant going back to the White House. So I just have one very simple question for you as you're suffering through the illness and still performing. How did you do that?
Denial. Denial that denial that it was happening to me. Denial that this amazing career that I had was all going to be just gone overnight in the blink of a bite. You know, this idea that I literally got sick overnight. And so this belief and hope that, well, tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be better. Tomorrow, the right doctor is going to listen to me and figure it out. Tomorrow, I'm going to get the magic shot or the magic pill, and I'm going to go back to being a Strike Eagle group commander or wing commander. And, you know, my career is going to continue to move on. So I think it was honestly denial. The rest of it was this expectation at the time. And, you know, my career was going really well. I mean, my OPR at the White House was hand signed by the President of the United States. You know, my next promotion board was looking, you know, at least competitive. And I didn't want to believe that it was over. Who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? What's my contribution to society if I'm not an Air Force officer and a fighter pilot? You know, how am I going to provide for my family if I lose my job? And so every day I would just get out of bed. And frankly, in hindsight, I wish I would have accepted things sooner. I think I caused a little bit more of my own unnecessary suffering as well as suffering for my family if I would have just accepted the outcome sooner. But I fought the Air Force to stay in. And ultimately, the MEB found me 100% unfit for duty due to tick-borne illness.
Yeah. And you fight to the bitter end, so much so that you conduct your own sit-in at the Air Force Surgeon General's office. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, ultimately, as I was still in search of this diagnosis, I was working at Joining Forces, full bird colonel, and I knew that I was dying. I knew that there was something very physically, biologically wrong, despite the gaslighting from both military and civilian medicine. And I knew that my husband and I were onto something when we looked at our medical records and we started, you know, back then Googling symptoms and figuring out, man, there's something about that bullseye rash. There's something about that second tick bite because everything is lining up what's written in the scientific literature. Mm-hmm. Yet the Air Force kept saying, you know, you've already been to the Mayo Clinic. We sent you to Walter Reed. There's nothing wrong with you. In fact, I got CC'd accidentally on an email from the colonel's group that referred to me as a malingerer.
For fighting for your life?
A malingerer, that I was trying to malinger to get to 20 years so I could retire, which I don't think I've ever received a greater insult in my life. But anyways, I knew I was dying. I knew that I had to live for my husband and my kids. And so I literally staged a sit-in. I walked over to the Pentagon, walked in it, and I'm literally having to hold up the walls. I had people at the Pentagon on 2 separate occasions ask me if I had been drinking. This is how embarrassing and horrible this illness is. I'm looking at them going, I'm not drinking. I can't walk. There's something wrong with me. And I went over there and I had a friend who was working, an academy classmate who was working as one of the junior execs to the Surgeon General. And he said, you know, come stage a sit-in. I'll see if I can fit you in. And to his credit, I got fit in and I met General Ediger, who I want to give credit to. He He sat, he goes, present me your case. And I presented the case and I said, this is the doctor I want to go see. It's up at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. And I need you to approve it because it's out of TRICARE network, this and that. At that time, General Goldfein, then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, knew who I was because I was working in the East Wing of the White House. He called and asked kind of simultaneously, what do you need? Next thing you know, those two gentlemen are talking. Next thing you know, my husband and I are on a plane to Boston. And I want to give credit to General Ettinger and General Goldfein for having compassion and curiosity and taking care of me. And at the same time, to this day, I hold very deep guilt that I was given special treatment. I was given special treatment because of who I was, because I had name recognition, because I was a full bird colonel, because I was working in the East Wing of the White House. And it hit me at that time, like, what are they doing to Airman Smith? You know, what are they doing to Sergeant Jones? And I knew at that moment, like, I had to get better because the system is screwed up and the system needs to change. And so, yeah, got sent to Boston, and lo and behold, within 24 hours, they figured it out.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But I want you to give yourself a little bit of credit because you spent your career fighting for other people and you fought so hard for yourself. And while you were fighting to make sure that you're fighting for your life, you were also fighting for what was right. And so I understand that you think it's special treatment, but I think they recognize that you were going to not go out without a fight because you would continue to fight for others.
Well, thank you.
And you have.
I have tried, sister.
And like you said, you got your diagnosis within 24 hours, but that also meant that you were going to meet your final medical board and you were ultimately recommended for discharge from the Air Force.
Yes.
How else did that final role at the White House become a bridge that helped you cross into your next life that was very abrupt?
Yeah. You know, what's cool, I think, about working at the White House, as hard as it can be, and believe me, how the sausage is made is very ugly in DC, and we're all, witnessing that right now. But I worked at the White House 3 different times, so I've seen how it's been made, but I've also seen the beauty, right, of America, regardless of political party or administration. I learned that while the military is amazing for so many reasons, teaching us teamwork and leadership and never leave your wingman and all those things, that the military doesn't have a monopoly on good leadership. It doesn't have a monopoly on teamwork. To be exposed to people from the civilian world, to be able to watch different industries and different professions. I was watching kids straight out of college writing amazing, policy papers. I was watching people well into their 60s and the wisdom and experience. And to realize, actually there's an entire world outside the military. We wear this uniform for 20 plus years and we get very myopic, I think, with our view of the world and our place in it. And I realized, there's a whole world outside of uniform. There's a lot, I think, to be excited about. And I was exposed in that last job at joining forces to essentially advocacy work, right? We were advocating for service members, veterans, military families. And I thought to myself, wow, I wonder if we can do advocacy work, in the Lyme disease and tick-borne illness community. So I learned a lot at the White House, and it allowed me, I think, to pivot to what I do now.
And the military almost made it a little bit too easy for you to pivot, because in December 2017, after 21 years of service, you were officially medically retired. What should be a joyous occasion was very different for you. So can you tell me about your retirement?
Sure. And I like people to hear this story, and I especially want military commanders and senior NCOs out there to listen to this. For the 2 years that I was bedridden, which was 2016, 2017, keep in mind, my husband is helping me go to the bathroom. He's bathing me. He's putting clothes on me. I cannot kick a soccer ball with my kids. I cannot talk to my kids. I am doing my best to make it through the treatment, right? I had a home health care nurse. I had a PICC line of antibiotics going to my heart. This 1.5 years in rehab to learn to walk, talk, read, and write again. So all this to say, this has been a hard 2 years. In those 2 years that I was bedridden in my Springfield, Virginia home just outside the Pentagon, not once, not on one occasion, did anybody from the Air Force, my chain of command anywhere, call or check in on me, my husband, or my kids, not once. We were struggling. My husband was working full time as my medical advocate. We were actually having to fight TRICARE. Believe it or not, I was getting bills from TRICARE, even though I'm active duty. We've still got to put our kids, through school. And so my retirement came on a very lonely day, the 29th of December, 2017. I was home alone, as I had been most of the time, because my husband had to go back to work to make money because I was about to lose my job. And I sat there all alone in the couch. There was no phone call from anybody in the Air Force. Nobody from the Strike Eagle community. None of my brothers that I had flown in combat with ever checked on us. Nobody called. And there was no ceremony. Half of my retirement paperwork was mailed to my home address in a manila envelope. Thank you for your service. And I remember like a week or two later, my husband surprised me with a little mini party at our house. He had a retirement cake and he didn't tell me about it. And I was only able to be out of bed for like 2 or 3 hours a day at that time. And I remember coming downstairs and the kids had decorated, there were balloons and this and that. And all of a sudden the door rings and maybe 20, 30 people came by. And I know I was supposed to be happy. And I know my husband and kids did this as the right thing and nice thing to do because they knew I felt bad. I didn't have a retirement ceremony. I didn't have a ceremony to thank them for supporting me through my career, to tell my kids they're great military kids. I never had that. But as these people flowed through the door, I remember looking at them and I didn't enjoy this party. I remember just looking at every single one of them thinking, where were you? Where were you? Why are you here now? For the free cake? Like, where were you? And I know that nobody did it to be mean or mean-spirited, but where were my wingmen when I needed them? You need to be there for people when they're at their lowest load, at their deepest, darkest parts. My family got me through those places without you. Where were you? That's all I kept thinking. And I couldn't wait for everybody to leave. I hate to say that, but that's the damn truth.
Yeah. And that must have ignited a fire in you because being removed from the career that you loved, right? The people, the purpose, that's devastating, right? It's devastating for people leaving the military in a normal way, in a happy way, right, to mourn a career because it is such a significant chapter of your life. But how it was handled really angers me and it saddens me because you deserved more. I think every service member deserves more than that. And you could have walked away bitter, but instead you do what you do best, which is you right the wrong. And you'll never be at 100% again, sadly, right?
Right.
Like you once were. But what's remarkable about you is that even on your worst day, you are still truly a force to be reckoned with. And you end up afterwards providing some unsolicited advice, right? And authoring recommendations to the Air Force Chief of Staff that resulted in this task force on support to airmen with complex medical conditions. Because you don't stop fighting for people. Tell me about that.
Well, like I said, if they were doing that to Colonel Malachowski, what were they doing to Airman Smith and Sergeant Jones and their families, right? And so literally the week after my medical retirement, like that first or second week in January 2018, I am in civilian clothes back in the Pentagon briefing the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force on my recommendations on how to change the regulations as far as patient squadrons and how to change the regulations as far as medical evaluation boards. That's because, again, kudos to General Goldfein. He did take the time to listen to my story. I was vulnerable enough to tell him the truth, how horrible the Air Force system was, and he did something about it. And my very first job was a pro bono job back to the Air Force for a few months working on this task force. Is the system perfect and great now? Absolutely not. Were there some good changes made? Yes. And I certainly was proud to be a part of it. I was still a colonel at heart. I still wanted to lead and I still do, damn it. And it was my way of still being a colonel, I think, and taking care of airmen.
So all of this kind of leads you into the next stage of your life, right? Where you have always used your voice, but now you are using it in a completely different capacity. So you become a keynote speaker and then launch headfirst into advocacy. What has this kind of work meant for you? And have you found a new community in all of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I lost my entire Air Force community, right? I mean, I can count on one hand the number of Air Force friends and Strike Eagle friends I have today, a decade later. I think that complex chronic illness is hard for people to understand. It's hard for people to support. You don't get it until you get it, kind of a thing. And there's just compassion fatigue. And I think the loneliness of the illness is the worst thing for me. The loneliness, the feeling of abandonment and betrayal has not left me. But the beauty in your question is I gained a whole new community. So the Lyme disease and tick-borne illness community absolutely motivate and inspire me every single day. It's an extraordinary community of just compassionate, caring, courageous people. And the idea that we can come together and use our strengths to make a difference, to give voice to the voiceless. This idea that I'm a fighter pilot at heart, right? And I'm still a little bit of that full bird colonel at heart. Like, I'm not going to sit by and let more people get gaslit when the science has rapidly evolved. I mean, this idea that complex tick-borne illnesses can cause chronic illness is no surprise to me, and the science is proving that. And because of my background and because of the credibility and success of that background, I am treated differently than a lot of other chronic Lyme disease and tick-borne illness patient. I am allowed to sit at the table, and I don't have a leg to stand on, Lilo, if I don't take that opportunity, right? I used to think my life's legacy, right, was that Nicole would someday maybe have a chance to be a flag officer and lead airman, and that she was a fighter pilot. And that's what I would be, rocking my grandkids on the porch talking about. And it's actually none of that. All of the skills and traits that I honed as a good wingman, the commitment and the compassion and the discipline and the courage, all of those traits as a fighter pilot were exactly what I needed to advocate for myself and survive my own illness. But more importantly, or as importantly, they're exactly the characteristics and traits I need right now to be moving the ball forward as part of this Lyme disease and tick-borne illness community. And I love that I can take my fighter pilot attitude to Capitol Hill, or I can take my fighter pilot attitude to these scientific committees and give voice to the voiceless and make a difference, just in a different way.
And that's what you're doing. You haven't stopped fighting. You are still informing people. You are still advocating, so much so that this year in May, you co-authored a pretty groundbreaking report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which is called Charting a Path Towards New Treatments for Lyme Infection-Associated Chronic Illness, a very long and complicated title.
Scientific title.
But it's huge, right? Because NASEM is a congressionally chartered scientific voice for the United States. And for the first time ever, which I found so shocking, is that the US is now officially saying chronic Lyme is real. This is 2025. So what is the impact of this report? Because I feel like this is way, way, way overdue, this acknowledgement.
I concur with everything you just said. It's way overdue. We've known, at least back in the patient advocacy space since the early 80s, that this was a problem, that not everybody who gets diagnosed and treated with the current standard of care, gets better. And what's happened is through the very unfortunate suffering of people with long COVID, we are now shining a light on all of these kind of infection-associated chronic illnesses. And one of the things is that term chronic Lyme can mean different things to different stakeholders. To patients, when we say that, we often mean that, hey, we got treated, but we're still sick, we're still symptomatic. Doctors or scientists, it may infer, this idea that you're still chronically infected. The truth of the matter is we don't know what is causing the chronic symptoms. And that's why this report is so important. First, it's shining a light on a new term, which is instead of calling it chronic Lyme, because we don't really know the etiology of it, let's call it Lyme, IACI, IACI, infection-associated chronic illness. Just like we know long COVID. We now know scientifically over the last 5 years, people have figured out, wow, you can get sick with bacteria and viruses and then go on to get these kind of acute infectious syndromes. And so the beauty of this report is it's casting the net, really wide. But to your point, it is the first time ever in history that anybody around the world has said, Lyme infection associated chronic illness is real. And what that does is open the door for research. What that does is open the door for funding. And ultimately what that does is open the door for a cure. You mentioned earlier, I'm not 100%. On my best days, I'm 60 to 70% of who I used to be. On an average day, like today, I will be in bed 18 to 20 hours. And yes, I do that even when I'm traveling on the road. You don't see that, on social media. That's not the stuff, that you put out there. But this idea that this report could get people up off of those beds they're laying in, off of the couches that they're sitting on. I have this weird dream that and I always say this to the scientists and the doctors that I'm on all these committees with, I'm always like, I just want to be cured one day, just one day in my life. And so this report is opening up for more research for treatments. We've been wasting a lot of time looking for the root cause, looking for the biomarkers. And what this report is saying is we need to do that. We still need to look for the biomarkers, but if we haven't found it in the last 40 years, how about we start looking at treatments to start alleviating these main symptoms that we have, which are fatigue, pain, and brain fog. People deserve to have symptomatic relief while we continue to look for a cure.
And the CDC estimates that up to 500,000 Americans are diagnosed with Lyme disease per year, which I found shocking. And upwards of 20% remain symptomatic despite receiving the antibiotic therapies. So that's about 100,000 new cases every year joining the ranks of those chronically ill patients. And then a recent study by the National Institute of Health found that patients saw an average of 10 doctors before they got diagnosed, which is better than your 24, right? But here's the part that should really enrage everybody. The study found that even the classic bullseye rash failed to convince many doctors that patients had an active Lyme infection, and that even their positive blood status didn't influence how likely a doctor was to believe that they had a tick-borne illness. So this is exactly what you went through. I find it incredible that that's a thing. So what does the validation mean for patients who've been called Lyme loonies, for those who are told that those symptoms are in their head, which happened to you, or are caused by stress or normal aging, or my favorite, we'll blame it on menopause? For the ones that are like you who had those positive tests dismissed, what does that feel like now?
Yeah, I think a lot of us, I'll speak for myself. I feel very vindicated, absolutely, because science is bridging the gap between my experience and what actually happened. I think so. There's vindication. I think this feeling of validation is very important to patient communities, especially with illnesses that are stigmatized and marginalized, like Lyme-Iacke is. And so there's this validation that, wow, okay, one, we're believed, and two, it wasn't all in my head. Remember, the gaslighting is legit in the Lyme disease and tick-borne illness community because of the lack of education and awareness. And so there's kind of an exhale of relief, I think, in our community right now. But we also know that we have a long way to go. This is merely a starting point. Science, unfortunately, takes a lot of funding. It takes people wanting to prioritize this. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of time. And so we are cautiously optimistic that this is the first step in the right direction.
And you mentioned that you served as experts on panels. So what has that journey been like for you, from being dismissed by your military doctors to now being the voice at the table that's now shaping national policy? How do you hold that responsibility?
It is a huge responsibility, and it is, I need to be accountable not only to, myself and my own integrity as I go through a very stigmatized and marginalized illness, but this idea of maintaining integrity and maintaining the Wingman contract to this Lyme disease and tick-borne illness community. I do feel a good, healthy level of pressure to make sure that I am representing our community with the dignity that they deserve, that when I have these very unique opportunities to be the voice in the room, that I am giving voice to the voiceless. And I feel a deep sense and a deep weight of responsibility, but I love it. I thrive in that environment. You know it, and I know it. It's like going into combat, Lilo. You train your whole life for this moment, and you train your whole life for me to sit at that table as the sole patient representative with 14 other, PhDs and MDs and all these people, and to just make sure that they understand the patient experience is huge. I'm not going to say I do it perfectly. I can tell you that I do the best that I can.
And I'm assuming that that sense of service has never left you. Is this fulfilling that role in a way?
Oh, 100%. You know, when people hear about my story, a lot of times I get oh, I'm sorry you can't fly anymore. Which, yeah, it'd be nice to kind of fly these days, I guess. And, you know, I did everything a fighter pilot could do. I got no complaints. But I always tell people it's not the flying that I miss. It's leading airmen. It's being a part of a team. And so in a very selfish way, by doing this patient advocacy work with my new team, my new Wingman, the Lyme and tick-borne illness community, I am very selfishly like filling that hole, you know, in my heart. And I always chuckle, you know, I'm sitting at these major scientific committees and conferences and, you know, testifying in front of Congress people and all this stuff. And I have like 2 master's degrees in national security policy. And the first published paper I ever author is a scientific paper. I always tell people I have a PhD. They're like, really? What's that? I said, my PhD stands for patient has disease. And I honestly, confidently feel like I could go on like tick-borne illness Jeopardy against 99% of the doctors, scientists, and clinicians in this country, and I would win.
Yeah.
And I would win based on peer-reviewed literature, and I would win based on science.
How dare you? How dare you with the science and peer-reviewed literature?
That's the fighter pilot attitude in me coming out. But let's go back to this idea of the Wingman and the Wingman contract, right? You know, this tick-borne illness and Lyme disease community, they were the ones that carried me through my deepest, darkest times. They were the ones that stayed by my side. They are the ones that are still with me today.
It is pretty remarkable. But you're not going to leave people behind, right? Even though the WASPs were left behind for 33 years and you got left behind in real time, you fought for them to be recognized. And now you're fighting for patients with multifactorial illnesses and those with tick-borne illnesses to be validated. So FiFi, I want to know, what is your truth now? Do you still believe that never leave your wingman behind is a lie?
It is not a lie. It is a truth. Never leave your wingman. And I think for the people listening today, you get to choose what kind of wingman you want to be. Are you a wingman in word only, or are you a wingman in action? I can't control what other people did or their behavior, but what I can control is me, and I will always be your wingman.
And for those that are listening who maybe know somebody that's going through something as life-threatening as this, or, you know, even something that is just as disastrous or just as catastrophic that maybe isn't related to illness. We talked about the compassion fatigue that, you know, some people have, but what is something simple that a friend or a colleague can do to show that they support you? What was the simplest act that you would have appreciated?
The simplest act I would have appreciated in those 2 years I was bedridden was someone simply picking up the phone to either text or call. Hi, I'm thinking about you. What could I do for your family? You know, and you. Checking in with my husband would have been nice. This idea to just sit with the person in their darkest times and listen. I wish someone would have just brought me a Starbucks and sat on the side of my bed and said, tell me how you're feeling right now. Mm-hmm. You know, I want to listen, and to not judge and to not say, oh, well, you know, my aunt had Lyme, or, well, I had it and I got better. Nope. Just sit with those people in their grief and listen. And I think, you know, taking it a step further, checking in at regular intervals, not getting compassion fatigue, being understanding that people's activities of daily living are going to change, and being a good friend to them as they kind of metamorphose into this, you know, new person. And I love it when people start doing research alongside of me, you know. Like you did, Lilo, right? I mean, you did research. You learned a lot about Lyme and tick-borne illness. And if my presence can make people a little bit more curious about that, I think our community would like that as well. And for those people that are feeling gaslit, you know, lean on those closest to you. You know, at the end of the day, who was there for me the whole time? My husband and my 2 kids. And who's still in my life today? My husband and my 2 kids. Everything else is simply like icing on the cake.
Yeah. Do you think you'll ever reconcile with the institution, with those individuals? Can they reconcile with you?
Oh, that's a deep question. I will never get over the feeling of abandonment. It's been 10 years and I'm still deeply hurt and deeply disappointed. For the people that fell out of my life, that was their choice. And I think that that's their loss. Ironically, I would say not a month goes by that somebody from my Air Force past doesn't write to me and say, oh, my daughter just got a tick. Here's a picture. What do I do? My spouse has been bedridden for a year and no one can figure it out. What do we do?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, early on, my first reaction was, where were you?
Yeah.
Right? If I haven't heard from you in the last 10 years, if I didn't hear from you in those 2 years that I was bedridden, and I do sometimes, my ego struggles with that.
Yeah.
But I realize that they're not my audience. My audience is the person that's bedridden.
Yeah.
My audience is that kid who's got a tick on their scalp and I need to help their dad, who I haven't talked to in 12 years, who came out of the blue out of nowhere for help. I need to help that kid. And so I do forgive. I do not forget.
Right. But you won't turn your backs on anybody because
Never. I've had doctors, girl, in that list of 24 doctors.
Yeah.
I have had some of them write to me and go, oh, hey, by the way, I got bit by a tick yesterday. What do I do? And I'm now the person sharing with these doctors who gaslit me because it's the right thing to do.
Correct.
Because it's about maintaining integrity to myself and to my values.
Yeah.
And so I will never turn anybody away, but I don't forget.
And who are the greatest wingmen for you now? And what are the programs and the people that you've seen be the greatest strength for you?
Well, 100%. My husband, Paul Malachowski, we just celebrated our 24th wedding anniversary. Talk about a man that lived up to his wedding vows in sickness and in health.
We love him.
We love him. And the fact that our marriage is even more fun and even stronger and just exciting than it ever was. And that I get to share this life with him, and our two kids, right, who have lived through this as well. The ages of 6 and 7, all they saw was mom, laying in bed, unable to interact and talk with them. And people, a lot of times feel bad about my kids and my husband, but I get asked what got you through. And what got me through was my kids. My kids were watching. And they have come out of this as little people. They're 15 years old now, which blows my mind, that are more compassionate than their peers are. I can see it. They're more compassionate towards other people. They're more confident in how to advocate for themselves. Ironically, my daughter just diagnosed her own autoimmune disease last week. I kid you not. This little self-advocate doing her own research. So she learned confidence. They learned self-advocacy, and most importantly, they learned what a good marriage looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I could give a better gift to our children. We talked a little bit about feeling alone and abandoned and betrayed, by the Air Force during those 2 years. But there was one phone call that came through about a year into it, and I was bedridden. And it came from a retired Air Force colonel by the name of Buff Burkell. She became an Air Force wounded warrior after enduring a major neck break during a helicopter accident in Afghanistan. Anyways, she was part of the Air Force Wounded Warrior program. We had met briefly across our careers, but a year into me laying in bed, the one phone call came through. Mm-hmm. And it was her. And she said, you need to know about the Air Force Wounded Warrior program. Yes. And I thought, that's not for colonels. That's not for fighter pilots. I wasn't injured in combat, and how wrong I was. The Air Force Wounded Warrior program is for everybody. And they picked me up. They helped me through the medical evaluation board. They helped me through fighting TRICARE over insurance as an active duty person. And they gave me a community, and I'm very proud to still be a member of the Air Force Wounded Warrior program as a mentor. And not a month has gone by over the last 10 years that I am not mentoring a young airman. Very selfishly, the colonel gets to still colonel. And people go, well, why do you risk your reputation? Sticking up for a marginalized community like Lyme disease, or why are you taking what limited time you have and, risking your reputation fighting for these airmen that are going to get MEB'd anyways? And I'm like, what's the purpose of a reputation if you're not willing to use it?
Exactly.
And so I worked my whole life in uniform for this moment, and I love it. I love it.
Well, FiFi, thank you for showing us that the most sacred code isn't only the one that they teach you in training. It's the one that you live by when the system breaks. And you turned your institutional betrayal into a mission to make sure that nobody else gets left behind. And that's not just service, that is a legacy of your enduring leadership and your continued work for those who are so easily forgotten, for those who are fighting for their voices to be heard clearly, and for those who suffer alongside you with this debilitating illness is nothing short of admirable. If you want to learn more about FiFi's advocacy work, visit NicoleMalachowski.com. If you don't know how to spell it, that's okay. Don't worry. As always, we will link all of our resources on liesmyego.com and in the show notes. For tick-borne illness information, check out Live Lyme Foundation and LymeDisease.org. This might be the season finale, but we'll be back in January. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for updates on season 2. And if you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, reach out to us. I'd love to hear from you. Finally, don't forget to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. FiFi, thank you for continuing to be a wingman for so many people, for refusing to leave anyone behind, and for using your platform and your voice for a force for good for others. And you are still my hero.
Well, Lilo, thank you. And thanks for being a great wingman to me.
Of course.